If we were ever asked, hey, is it possible to implement digital certificates as part of our VPN connection profiles? And if so, can you do it? I want the response as a result of your and my time together in this nugget to be a resounding yes. Let's begin. In preparation for this nugget, I did a couple of things that I'd like to share with you behind the scenes. Number one, I installed certificate services on DCNUG, and I created a group policy that pushed the root certificate out to all the machines in the domain. So our starting point is that all the devices know who the root CA is, and they all trust the root CA certificate. And I named the root CA our root CA. Now for more training, in fact for a lot of training on digital certificates and PKI and certificate services, I want to point you over to course 70-742, which deals extensively with the behind the scenes of how that works and how to set it up. And for our purpose in this nugget, what I want to walk you through is how we can use digital certificates that have been handed out by a certificate authority and use them as part of our VPNs. So our client connected on the outside network, as it builds a VPN over to server 2, who's our network access server, or if you want to call it RAS, remote access server, that works too. As that client builds the VPN tunnels, we've got a few VPN profiles currently that are working here on the client. We've got L2TP that works with IPsec. We've got PPTP, and I've also got one for IPv6 that's also doing L2TP with IPsec. And they are all currently functional. Now currently, as part of IPsec for both of those, we are using a pre-shared key. And that pre-shared key is configured in both of the profiles for L2TP, the one for IPv4 and the one for IPv6. And that pre-shared key is used specifically for IPsec. Now, if we wanted to use digital certificates instead of that pre-shared key for IPsec, we'd do two basic things. Number one, we'd make sure that each machine has a machine digital certificate that it can use installed on it. And then secondly, we just configure that digital certificate to be used as part of our VPN connection profile along with L2TP IPsec. We'd also want to make sure that the VPN gateway that we're connecting to is also set up so it can verify the digital certificate that the client is presenting. And as part of the group policy that I set up for the domain, I've pushed out a machine certificate to every machine in the domain. So server 2 has one, client NUG has one. So when we're using machine certificates for authenticating an IPsec tunnel, which is what we're doing here, or about to do here, it doesn't mean the user no longer has to authenticate. So we're going to have two things in play. We're going to have machine certificates that are being used for the authentication of the IPsec tunnel, and we'll also have the additional component of user authentication, like Bob or Mary or Sally, that represents the user behind that computer that also needs to do the authentication. And that leads me to my next point. What if we don't want to have each and every user authenticate by putting in their username and password? Couldn't we use digital certificates for authenticating a user as well? And the answer is absolutely yes. In addition to machine certificates that validate the actual computer that's building the tunnel, we could also use user digital certificates, also issued by the certificate authority. And we'd specify that we want to use that digital certificate for the authentication piece of the end user. Which means right here on this client that if we have a machine certificate and the user logging onto that machine has a user certificate, we could use both of them as part of our VPN connection profile. And then the user, when they build that VPN tunnel, they wouldn't have to put in manually any of their credentials because we're using digital certificates to authenticate both the computer as well as the user behind that computer. So in the lab, I'll walk you through step by step in setting up both. Now also behind the scenes, this computer, this client, has another network adapter that's currently plugged in to the corporate network. We're going to need that for a few minutes while we make sure that the client has both a machine certificate installed on it and also a user certificate. And for this lab, we're logging onto this client machine as administrator. And then once we make sure we have the certificates, we'll disconnect that network connection to the corporate network, and then we'll use our VPN connections to get access. So both DCNUG and Server 2 are both powered on. I've logged on to make sure they're up and running and available. And we're going to do most of our work right here on client NUG. So first things first, let's verify that we have both user and machine certificates to use with our VPN connection profiles. And to do that, I've got a little shortcut here on the desktop for the Microsoft Management Console, so we can take a look at both machine and user certificates. So we'll just go ahead and double click on that icon to open up the Management Console. And we'll click yes for user account control. And let's go ahead and start with user certificates. It's up on top, so we'll expand that. And if we click on personal, so under certificates, current user, personal, you'll notice over here on the right, there are no user certificates. So the easiest way to get one here in this lab environment is to go ahead and simply request one. So to do that, we'll go ahead and right click on personal under current user. And then from the drop down, we'll go ahead and hover over all tasks. And then from the submenu, we'll select request new certificate. And we'll click on that. It gives us a little overview of what's about to happen with this enrollment. We'll click on next to continue. We have an enrollment policy that's currently selected. We'll click on next to accept that. And then we'll scroll down just a little bit and we'll click on the user certificate in the bottom left-hand corner here. And then we'll click on enroll. And it's done. It's that easy. So we'll click on finish. And then now under certificates, current user, personal, if we expand that and click on certificates, now we have a certificate issued to administrator, issued by our root CA, and it'll have an expiration date approximately 1 year from whenever you're running this lab, because it was just issued and it's good for a year. So fantastic. Now we have a user certificate on this local computer that we can use for user authentication if we want to as part of a VPN connection profile. Next, let's go take a look at machine certificates. So to do that, let's go ahead and collapse certificates-current user, and let's expand certificates for the local computer. So if we click on personal here, this personal under certificates local computer is referring to computer or machine certificates. So if we expand that by clicking on personal and then clicking on certificates, you'll see here that we currently have a certificate for client-nug.nuggetlab.com, this computer that we're on. You'll also notice that we have an expiration date here on the certificate. And here's what I'd like you to do. If this expiration date right here has already passed based on when you're doing this lab, I'd like you to go ahead and simply renew the certificate. And to do that, you simply right click on the certificate. From the drop down, select all tasks. And then from here, you can do renew certificate with new key, or if you go down to advanced operations, you can renew the certificate with the same key. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And then we'll step through the wizard and click enroll and click on finish. And the benefit is we want to make sure that the expiration of that machine certificate is after the current date that you're doing the lab, so that that certificate can still be considered valid. All right, fantastic. So we've got a user certificate and we have a machine certificate. Let's go ahead and minimize the console. Next, let's right click on the Windows icon in the bottom left-hand corner and select network connections. And let's disable our inside interface. We'll right click on inside 192 and from the drop down select disable. So now we've just got our one outside interface, outside-23, and our VPN connections that we can use to build tunnels. So if we just double click on any of the current VPN connection profiles, that'll bring up these settings with VPN selected. And from here, we could go ahead and test them. And that wouldn't be a bad idea. It's just to verify that they work. So if we click on IPv4 PPTP and click on connect and give that a moment, that says connected. That's great. We'll click on disconnect. We'll go to IPv4 L2TP with IPsec. Click on connect. This is the connection that's currently using pre-shared keys with IPsec that we configured in an earlier nugget. And with that connected, if we right click over here on that connection and click on status from the drop down and then go to details, it can give us the details about that connection. So we'll go ahead and click on close. We'll disconnect that, and we can also test our IPv6 by clicking on that connection profile and clicking on connect. So they all work. We'll go ahead and click on disconnect. And what we want to do is we are going to add some new connection profiles that leverage the digital certificates. Let's first start off by doing an L2TP IPsec connection that instead of using a pre-shared key, we'll go ahead and use a digital certificate on the client NUG computer. And so to do that, let's go ahead and just click on add a VPN connection. I would encourage adding instead of copying an existing one, and that way we know exactly what we're putting in. We're not carrying over any details. So the VPN provider is Windows built in. And for the connection name, let's name this machine cert L2TP IPsec. And for the server address we're connecting to is 23.1.2.102. That's the outside IP address of server 2, our VPN gateway. And for the VPN type, we want to go ahead and do L2TP IPsec with certificate. And we'll scroll down a little bit more. And the type of sign-in information will be username and password. So the certificate is for the authentication of the machine effectively as we build the IPsec tunnel, and the user is still going to have to provide their username and password. And what we can do here is we can go ahead and say, please don't remember my sign-in info, and that way it won't cache that information. So for here, for this connection profile, I want to see us put in the username and password each time we connect. So we'll go ahead and click on Save. And here's our machine cert, L2TP IPsec, but we're not quite done. Let's go ahead and do a couple more things. Let's right click over on that connection profile over here on the left and go to Properties of that new connection profile. And let's check a few details here. On the Security tab, let's click on the Security tab. And for L2TP with IPsec, that's great. That's exactly what we want. We're going to click on Advanced Settings and make sure that Use Certificate for the authentication of that VPN tunnel is selected as opposed to using a pre-shared key. So that looks good. We'll click on OK. And then for user authentication, we still want to use EAP. So we'll click the radio button for Use Extensible Authentication Protocol. And from the drop down, we'll go ahead and make sure that Secured Password EAP MSCHAP v2 is selected. And if we wanted to, we can click on Properties and say automatically use my Windows login name and password. But I'd like to leave that blank for now so we can see that we're manually putting in the username and password each time for this connection. So we'll click on Cancel for that and click on OK. And now let's go ahead and try the connection. So with machine cert L2TP IPsec selected, we'll go ahead and click on Connect. It's asking for a username and password. We'll supply the username of administrator and our lab password, making sure we type that in correctly. Great. And click on OK. And ta-da! Yay! So then if we disconnected and we reconnected again, because we told it not to save our credentials, the user has to authenticate every single time. So we'll do it one more time for good measure with our username and password and click on OK. Fantastic. So let's click on Disconnect. Next, let's create a VPN profile that uses a machine certificate like we did here for the building of the IPsec tunnel, but let's also use a user certificate for the authentication of the user. So to do that, let's click on Add VPN Connection. For the VPN provider, we'll use Windows built-in, and let's call this one Machine and User Certs L2TP IPsec. The server address is going to be 23.1.2.102. That's the outside IP address of server 2. And the VPN type is going to be L2TP IPsec with certificate. And we'll scroll down a little bit. And the type of sign-in information is also going to be certificate. And then it won't need a username and password from us once we have this set up correctly. So we'll click on Save. All right, let me scroll down a little bit. And let's tell it not to remember the sign-in info. It won't really matter too much because the user is not going to be prompted for a username and password because we're using a digital certificate for the authentication of the user. So we'll click on Save. There's our machine and user certs L2TP IPsec. And before we try to launch that, let's go look at all the properties here. So we'll right-click on the left-hand side under Network Connections. We'll right-click on that new profile and click on Properties. So from here, we're going to connect to that IP address of server 2. That's great. Under Security, we're using L2TP. That's great with IPsec. If we click on Advanced Settings, it says to use a certificate for the authentication of the IPsec tunnel. Fantastic. We'll click OK. And then for authentication, check it out. It correctly says use a smart card or other certificate. And that's because of what we put in. But what we also need to do is click on Properties to give it a little bit more detail regarding the certificates that we're going to be using for the user authentication. So we'll click on Properties right here. And we want to make sure that use a certificate on this computer is selected, which it is. It's also going to verify the server's identity by validating the certificate. And what we want to do is scroll down and we want to grab our CA. Either one of these our root CAs will do. They're both the same. And also, we don't need to connect to any of these servers, so we'll remove the check next to connect to these servers. And then we'll click on OK. So as long as this computer has a user certificate that's signed by this CA, our root CA, which the entire domain trusts, we should be able to use that for the authentication instead of the user having to manually put in credentials. So let's go ahead and click on OK and OK. And now we'll go ahead and test it. So we'll click on Machine and User Certs L2TP IPsec over here on the right and click on Connect. And it verified the connection and we are in. If we right click over here on this network connection for that VPN connection profile and go to Status and then click on Details, it's got the details for that connection. And if we close that and disconnect and reconnect, it's not going to ask the user for any credentials because those are being supplied by the user certificate. And to verify our connectivity, we could bring up, for example, the PowerShell scripting environment, and we can do a test-net connection. And let's go over to DC-nug and hit F8, and that'll verify name resolution and also connectivity. It'll also verify the interface we're using, and I wasn't expecting it to use IPv6, but by George, that's what it did. Currently, the VPN is set up to support both IPv4 and IPv6, and it went for IPv6. So it did name resolution for DCNUG, got its IPv6 address, and then did a ping to that IP address using our VPN interface. So if we didn't want to use IPv6 for that, what we could do is disconnect that connection, edit the properties of that VPN profile by right-clicking on it, going to Properties, and then for networking, we could simply say we don't want to use IPv6, remove that from the list, click on OK, and then go ahead and connect once again, and now it's going to be just IPv4. So if we go back to our PowerShell, expand that, and run that same command again with an F8, now I'm expecting it to be IPv4 based and not IPv6. Fantastic. And now, my friend, I would encourage you to have some fun in the lab practicing and playing with this. And besides just working with the VPN connection profiles, feel free to go back and look with Network Policy Server at Server 2 at how it's configured if you want to see more details on that, or the routing and remote access configuration, all of which we've covered in our previous nuggets, but it can help reinforce that knowledge. And because this lab is built for you to practice and play in, please feel free to utilize this resource. So I'm glad that you joined me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.